So we're talking about basically our philosophy about doing the design work and simplifying our design for better communication. And as we've been doing this, and I've been teaching the class, and even with pencil, and this has happened since 2009, so it's been 10 years I've been teaching the pencil class and then got onto teaching the digital, is that we have a certain amount of training in our minds and a cultural aesthetic that we're taught about how things should look. And that's, of course, with every culture has their style. There's European graphics. If you're into graphic design, it's amazing what comes out of the UK and out of Europe. And everybody's always wondering, why doesn't that come out of the US, or why doesn't that come out of my country? It's just amazing to see the culture and how the effect it has on design. Well, that really carries through to our design work here. And especially if you aren't a graphic designer and you haven't had an experience to kind of go through some of those things and understand what your effect is on people when they see the design work, it's kind of good to know there's some simple rules to help keep it clear. And as I mentioned about personal preferences and what good design is, one of my rules are there are blue spruce, but they're not really blue. And there are very few orange and purple shrubs. And people use identification in multiple ways in their designs. It basically is confusing to our clients. And so what I like to talk about basically is how we can just keep everything organic, keep it really to the earth tones, and how people really seem to appreciate that. So I wanted to talk a little bit too about what I'm working on in our next steps of doing our reporting. And this is aside from the design, but in the past, all of my reports to my clients has been in Word docs. And we'll do that in our process of design. A lot of using Microsoft Word, and I'm a big mind mapper. So this is from MindJet. And my last big project, which is huge, I was assessing 57,000 acres, just doing a site assessment on Molokai in Hawaii, in the Pacific. And it was amazing. And like I said, anything you're going to do in Hawaii takes at least 2 weeks. So they're doing that. But then to do the report on this, it was so complex. And to do it in linear fashion as a Word doc just made absolutely no sense to me. And I've been doing mind mapping for years. And finally now I found out that I could actually turn this whole report as a mind map into HTML. And so I delivered the report to them in HTML that they could open up in a browser. And all of the clicks on here, they could open up each topic and it would scroll down and then open up the details on any of those that they would want to. And it was very much appreciated, especially because this was going to a lot of classrooms and students and people in different organizations for ecological restoration and Molokai. And so I'm really encouraged. So anybody who in the group, or if you haven't gotten into mind mapping, MindJet or XMind, I think this is the next level of reporting things to our clients, is to get off the documents and get it basically web-based, get it in HTML like this is. You can add documents, you can add links. It's pretty amazing. And the nice thing about it, as you look at it here, it's almost a graphical representation. And the MindJet, the way it works, is actually more like how our brain is set up, because you can actually remember things based on where it is you saw it on the map. But you can also add new information and see how it affects everything else in balance. It's like your own table of contents is right on the screen all the time, but it has all the information. So we'll look into this. You can see the designs and one of the columns to the right there. We have all little PDFs of all the designs, and they can click on that and open up large ones. We have photographs from being on site. We have data and charts and all those kinds of things. So this is the kind of the next level. And I think really for communication is, as much as we can get access for people and understand the design, just like we do with our maps, in this way, mapping this information for our clients is, I think, really helpful. So some of the things that we want to think about when we're doing design is how information is perceived. And there's a lot of mindset. What's that? I'm not understanding. What next slide? Oh, really? Let me back up. You don't see that?
No, this is isolated.
Oh, I don't see that. Oh, this is bizarre. Okay, now you have my screen. I have your screen. Anyway, I understand now. Sorry about that. So if I go like that, why is it not changing? It's very odd. Okay, let me, I'm gonna escape out of this and start it again. I'm trying to just give you the straight slideshow. I don't want, what do you call that? Presenter view.
Maybe click on use slideshow on top. Could you try that?
Let's see. I see play from start, play from current slide, presenter view, custom show. Why is it not giving me slideshow? Oh, on top, slideshow, play from start. Let's try that. And I wanted to record this also, but it is being recorded. Let's see what happens here. You just see two of them again?
Yeah, nothing changed.
Okay. Let's stop share. Sorry, everybody. It's good that I have a screen over here to look at. I'm going to go back here. Stop this. Show. All right, I'll go back to share screen. All right, happiness. Hopefully, it'll stay that way. Okay, I'm not starting over. All right, great. So here's an example of two maps. And this is actually the subway, the tube in Washington, D.C. And I'm sorry about the left one not being very good resolution, but you kind of get the idea. And the issue is, what was important to the designer here is that the tracks actually reflect where the tracks are. Every little bend, every little angle. And then some of the cities are actually diagonal and harder to read relative to which direction the tracks are going. So there was a certain sort of formula in the person's head doing this, and it was about representing where the tracks were, which was more important than communicating where the stations were. And if you say, like on the right, and you see that one the upper left track that's red, dotted red, it's a straight line, even though there's curves in that track. Well, the train's not going to drive off the track because the map says the track is straight, right? But the key is all the stations are readable without being at angles, and you can know the order of the stations. And that's the only thing that people care about is like, okay, what color train and what are the stations that I need to go to, especially with tourists and things like that. So as you can see on the left, it's very complex. The lines are thick for the track, and then the text is very small, whereas the line weight on the right, the tracks is much smaller, but the text is very easily read because it's all horizontal. And so what we want to make sure is that we don't get into our own design head and forget that we're trying to communicate information to people. And as much as we want to be realistic, sometimes it's a representation of what the item is. When we do a chicken coop or something like that, it's a box, and there might be a label that says chicken coop. It doesn't have the roof line. It doesn't sometimes even have the right size. And it's just basically where the thing is, and there's other details that will come later to that. So this was kind of I thought, a great example of communicating what's important to the client, and not basically what has to be always just so perfect as far as what we think is representative of this situation there. This is another case of the one on the left, where then let's put, okay, it looks that bad, let's put it on brown paper. So that's another thing too, is it doesn't make it more easy to read. It's not helping. It's like people that put blue type on black or red type on blue. It's just really hard on the eyes. And you can even see all the colors of the stripes, and we're going to get into this a lot, of the left map. All the blue lines, the orange lines, the purple and yellow actually make it harder to read what the text is, because our brain is constantly kind of being confused by all these other colors. So keeping the colors to a minimum and muting them is great. Now, on the map on the right, they kind of use the same colors, but like you'll see when we get into the design, you can mute things back 10, 20% of what they should be in transparency and still communicate quite well. And it actually gives you layers of information. So a lot of the information that we're going to show in our maps is in layers. It's like the topography. You don't really need to see it all the time. So we screen it back so it's like a 20%. And it is there. And if you want to see it, you look for it. Oh, there it is. I can see that line. And then after that point, you actually, now it shows up and you can see it. So it's really kind of nice to just layer things in, as we do a lot. And we actually can use transparency and many, many different types of techniques to make that happen. This is another article that came out about no more rainbows, and it was written for scientists. So when you see, like in the upper left, you see a lot of these red, green, blue maps, and how this is supposed to be some information that's important, which is great. But when you're working in ArcMap or any of the software programs, even in Excel, they have their red, green, blues, but they also have more colors, and they will give you color schemes to choose from. So in this case, the map on the top left and the map on the the bottom left is the same information without that huge contrast. Does it communicate? Sure. Does it make you think that the top is like on fire and the bottom is underwater? No, it's basically just relative to the space. And also you see blue and you see green, so it kind of gives you a sense, a lighter sense. Now you see on the right, they actually added the topography in there, which again is very helpful, which is important to us. But it gives it now kind of that 3D sense as we see both of those. So again, it's about selecting our colors and being very careful how we select them and muting them and keeping our color palette to a minimum. This is another example of that, and this is saturation. This is a picture of Maui, and they're both basically about the rainfall in this, and it's actually the same map, but what you can see is the bottom one is muted. Now this was done in Photoshop, and it was basically just knocking down these colors so they weren't so much in your face, and it all gives you keep those colors muted and makes enough contrast so you can tell the difference. But then knowing where that line is, you don't really have to do a lot of contrast in order for our eyes to tell the difference, because we have very good perception. Our eyes can actually, I don't know, it's like, I forget what the numbers of colors. I think it's like 12 million or 13 million colors that our eyes can differentiate. The screen in our computer can only do 6 million. Printouts can only do 13,000. So if you can imagine, our eyes can pick out a lot more detail. Even on the screen, we can tell a difference between pixels and things like that. So we don't have to be so obvious with the color. We can have very good, high subtlety, and people will still be able to read what we're doing. So here's another example of somebody else's design where they're just using earth tones, muted tones. To them, what was important, of course, as you see here, was really where the towns are, and then they just had a very simple numbers on the letters, or excuse me, numbers on the rainfall. So a very simplified map with about the same information, a little bit difference in their scale of what they're doing, but a much more pleasant map. Now, do you want to use that same typeface? Maybe not, because it's kind of like over the top in style, but still it's a much easier map to read and much more pleasant. So you also see transparency, so you see the underlying type on things, and we do that a lot with transparency. So here's another case. These are the life zones of Maui, and these are based on the biomes for Holdridge, based on the World Life Zone System. And there's a whole system of describing biomes and also life zones in the world, and they have these color palette that you use, and it's pretty much the same. But it also is kind of hard to figure out which is which and not easy to look at. So again, we could take something like this, and when you bring it into Illustrator, you could do this, or in Photoshop, you basically, as you can see, the sliders here on the top right, that's in Photoshop. I just boosted and changed the color a little bit, dropped the saturation, and made it 24 points lighter. And I haven't changed any of the data. I haven't changed the color palettes or any of that because everything changed at the same time. But in this sense now, it basically is much easier for our eyes to read, and we have less eye fatigue. And as people are looking at our maps, that's a big challenge we have because we want to have a lot of information. We want people to look at our work for a long time, stare at it. It's like a story in pictures, right? All this graphical information. We want them to stare at this a long time. If there's any kind of eye fatigue, it really much goes away. Also, color maps and tones like this are available in many of the software. If you go to more colors, you can get these kind of sequential maps and these gradients. And these gradients are nice to use in things like this. They have them in a lot of the software packages. You can actually pick the gradient that you want, and it will use that in your scale and break it up into sections. So it makes it that much easier to see. But you can see the one on the left and how gentle that flow is till you get to the deep colors. And then basically the solid color, gray, bone, pink, spring, they just have names for these different things of related tones to work together. So these are available to us when we're trying to do charts and things like that. And originally this presentation was developed for a conference of ecosystem restoration scientists. Basically, I was the only one there trying to convince them to do something different for their design work. Now when we're getting into our actual design work, and this is from a drone picture. So you can see as we're looking at our work, the kind of things that we do. This is in Senegal. The color map here, or the tones, pretty limited. This is Senegal, lots of sand, lots of dead organic material, and then green trees. So not a lot to work with on this as far as the color palette. But I'm not going to come into something like this and start putting in all sorts of fancy blues and rainbows. I need to stick with what the local colors are because that's what the people are seeing and that's what they can actually relate to. So when we get into the designs, it's very muted back colors, greens, and then in the background of this, it's kind of hard to see on these screens, but in the background of this is actually the aerial. But what I also wanted to say is that the design on the right is actually for us, for the designers, for the stakeholder. So you can see all the muted tones there. You can see the topography, the drip irrigation that we have set up in the irrigation lines that are there. We have nice labels. Notice the labels on the top half on the right map. They're kind of a green, sort of a off green, but they're also muted back. You don't really see any black on here except for the fruit trees and the lists on the left side where the polycultures are. Most everything inside is kind of sticking to the same sort of contrast and tone that's easier to read and much easier on the eyes. Also, when you step back, it can disappear. So when I'm looking over the whole map, I don't have any one thing kind of distracting me away. Now, this is majorly on the irrigation. You can see how that's about the main thing that pops off of here, but there's a lot of trees in here, planting areas, and other things that can be seen. The one on the left, as I was talking about having to relate information going up, the one on the right was for the staff and going to the builders and the installers, and also when we're working with the farm managers and people working on it. The map on the left was actually for the board of directors of the organization. And that one basically just had colors. All their interest. They didn't need to know or want to know all about the drip irrigation. They don't need to know a lot of the details of the plants. They wanted an understanding of the pattern. So we have a pattern of planting on that, broad brush strokes that's communicated to them, but it's still muted back quite a bit so that they can see what they need to see, and they don't need to go any further unless they want to look into it deeper that way. So, and that is very easy to do because those color tones are just basically washing over the other things, and then I just turned off the irrigation. On the title block, which is what this map is, this is called the title block. We have our design in the big area, and that's on one file. We place that inside the title block, so we have two separate files. But then we have all of our characteristic information on the right. All of that, of course, is done in Illustrator, but all of that information also comes from our data table, which we'll be opening up and looking through. We have our sun angles on here that come from the data table. We have their sunfall or sunrise and sunset. We also have other maps on here and other sorts of graphics that we get off of websites. And then also there's a map on here. Basically, it might be a soil map. So that's what the title block is for, is basically who are the stakeholders, what is being told here, where are we, what's the name of the project, and then the characteristics of the project, and then we have the design itself. When we have room, and it varies a lot, there might be plant lists, things like that. When there isn't room, then we have other documents that support this, but we do try to put as much on these as possible. And I wanted to tell you about this picture here. When we're working in other countries, so this is the village mayor. This is in Senegal. This village does not have a school. They have no written language. Everything is basically oral histories and then just living life. So when we went to this farm, I had one of these other maps with me sitting in the back of the truck. And like in a lot of cases, this is the decision maker. This is the mayor of the village. And they're telling, making plans what to do. But in many of these countries, they don't have an aerial perspective, whereas we have aerial perspective all the time. Their perspective is always elevation. They don't look at things from the sky. They don't draw things out like that. They only point on elevations, what's going to go on, and they walk through their space. So the mayor is there. I have my Mavic Pro, which is the drone. I had gotten these goggles previous to the trip. And through the interpreter, we had translations. I was just saying, I'd like to have the mayor fly up into the sky and he can see over his land. And he put these goggles on, and we had him hang onto the truck. And then the lady to my right there is actually the translator, and she's telling him what's going to happen. So on the hood of the cab of the truck is the drone. And first I show him how, as he moves his head back and forth, he can move the camera. So this is like amazing technology. I mean, for me, but imagine a lot of people there, they have their phone and that's about it, right? There might be a TV somewhere. So for him, this was like a new thing, but he's like the chief. So he's looking around. Okay, he understands how the camera moves. He can move the camera. And then they say, hang on, we're going to go into the sky like a bird. And then I just shot that thing up about 400 feet. And he's laughing. He's just laughing and thinking it's so funny, having a great time. And then he starts to look around. The interpreter is telling him how to manage the camera and look around. And he's pointing and he's talking to them about things. They're all kind of laughing. And then all of a sudden he gets really serious because he's now noticing things. He sees things because he said, okay, that's that field. This is this field. This is where a village is. There's where the ravine is. And now he starts telling them things about what's going on from 400 feet, and he's looking all over. And then after about 10 minutes, we come down and he takes it off. And what he sees is one of these maps in the back of the truck, and he immediately just says, I want one of those, right? He wants a map of his village. He wants a map of all of his farms so that he can actually now communicate. And if I could, that would be one of our main duties, especially like in Haiti, we're setting up to do this, and in other countries, is just give people maps of their place. Laminated maps with grease pencils, whatever it takes to help them plan and see their land in a holistic sort of view and be able to design on it. And I think we were very successful in this case with this chief, with this farmer. And we knew that all the time because when we're doing design classes in other countries, there's a mixture of elevation and aerial because they aren't used to drawing from above, that kind of perspective. But that tells you also how powerful our maps are as just a tool, even just the base map for people to use so they can draw and they can design and help plan what they want to do for the next season or whatever their issues are. Everybody can visually communicate what they're talking about because they'll all know where that space is when they're looking at it.
I have a quick question from Tara. How can you adjust for color blindness? I suggested using grayscale. She asked if
Right.
grayscale would be different for the client.
Right. So if your client has a color blindness is the question, and of course that varies hugely between people. You kind of have to know what they're colorblind to, but I know it's a lot of with the oranges and the greens. And that's where then you need to have good contrast and lots more grays and take out the saturation. So if you have more grays in there, it'll be easier to see. But if you have intense greens, like what's behind here on the right here, we have these yellows and the reds and the greens there, that would be very difficult for them to see. If you mute out the color and have more grayscale, that's much easier for people to see. It's different for everybody. So not a hard thing to do too is you can take your design even and bring that into Photoshop and give them an adjusted map. And it's going to evenly change all the colors to more grayscale and take out what makes it difficult. There's also adding texture, labels, those kinds of things, but maybe sticking with the grayscale. It all just depends. If they have a certain range of colors that they can see, use that as your palette. Use that as what might show. But if it's green and reds, I'm not colorblind. I'm actually not sure what people are actually seeing and what the issue is with that. But they also, I know that there's some amazing glasses that I saw that people put them on and then they can see color. I don't even know if that's real. But people, they're crying and they put these glasses on for the birthday and they actually can see colors. So maybe there's other ways that we can fix that too. So visual sensitivity. Okay, here we go. 7 million colors we can see. Digital screens produce 6 million. Loud colors and contrast create eye fatigue. The cones and rods in our eyes have to work really hard when we have all these different colors. And they also change. If you've ever seen that thing where red is in front of blue, red always looks like it's in front because red is in front in your eyes even, where the color is perceived is in a different position in your retina that way. So again, we want to keep these to a minimum. These are called color ramps. This is in QGIS where they actually allow you to pick the color ramps if you want to have different colors for showing topography or shapes or things like that. We don't use a lot of gradients in our design, but we do sometimes, especially when we get into, say, ponds and there's depth, or sometimes if there's height or things that we're trying to show. But when we do these, we have to be very careful because sometimes they turn into raster, which is pixel colors, as opposed to just using our solid colors. So they actually add to our file size when we're working this way. Here's a couple of other examples. Calm function. Let me get this thing out of my way here. Here we go. So more of a calming color palette. And so on the left here, you have, again, those world life zones with reds and oranges and greens. And on the right, we have basically the map that I did for them in that same area. And I'm just using greens and yellows. You can see there's like 3 different greens, a yellow tone on there, and then where they go over the top of each other with multiple layers. Still about the same amount of information. It's a different kind of information, but you can see kind of the different effect of seeing that. And also, like I said, it's very hard for us to read black text on red, or any of those kinds of tones. So that's more or less, it's a very good map with a huge amount of information that I use, but I also will change it over in color-wise to what I want to use. And also you can see how that produced in black and white with the reds and all those tones, kind of hard to see. And on the other side, in the far right corner, you can see it a little bit better with the yellows and the greens as far as popping out, because a lot of things have to come out of laser printers as we do this. Also, simplicity of color. These are just color palettes that are online. And if you just do color palettes, Google those, you can find lots of colors that work forward. If you want to go Ralph Lauren or some kind of paint chips, that's pretty funny how they put them together, but they know the colors that work together well. So colors that don't compete, they contrast, but they actually are easier on the eyes to work with. And you can see how muted these tones are. They actually are much easier to see. We still have a good contrast, but they're not going to cause eye fatigue. Reducing color and contrast in black and white. So it increases options for color variation when we use transparencies or transparency in the color. It actually, then we actually have more colors. We have the regular color, and then at 5, 10, 15%, 20%, it actually can use the same tone and get different perceptions. It increases our depth of detail. So as you can see in this map in the center, There's topography is on there. It kind of disappears as you go into the greens, but when you look, it actually reappears if you look for it, but it's not confusing us. It's not adding more detail, and we still see the patterns of the land. Multiple data can be shown when we have these layers. We have the names, we have the trees, we have actually an aerial in the background, different colors for the different types of characteristics, and then the topography is on there also. The visibility of the text comes through. Grayscale actually prints much better also because the laser printers actually print gray much better than the colors do, than the color is printed. So you have a much better, you might say, ramp of grayscale that you can print that way. Reduces the eye fatigue, and then it draws the viewer closer. What's nice about these maps, and we have more detail, is if you look at a big one and people will look at it from a distance, but if you can get them to walk forward and look at it closer, that means they're looking for more detail, and we have more detail. The longer people look at our designs, the more likely they are to hire us, and the more the design is appreciated. The value of the design actually goes up. Here's a couple more maps that I've seen online from people doing. We have some, and this is all done by computer, but again, you can realize as you see how this is done before, we don't need the dark reds, the bright blues. All of the same information can be related if we just tone it down and use different things. I also would say about the icons that we use is one little tiny dot does a lot. When I use Google Earth and they give you that big yellow tack, if you go into info, you can change that to a little dot. You can change that to pretty much everything, or even just turn it off. Do a layer. So we have to be careful about the size of things, the size of text, because that is actually distracting and overwriting the kind of work that we're trying to do. So on all the numbers on there, all the little icons on there actually kind of distracts us from what the actual purpose of that map is. So more in tones, but I wanted to show you this one too. This is a cover. This was done probably in InDesign or Illustrator, University of Washington. And there again, they have their what we call graphic standard. And that's what we have at United Designers also, and we're trying to develop, is we have a style and a graphic standard. So you can just imagine going inside this brochure or inside this website, they're actually thinking very carefully of color and making it very gentle on the eyes and easy for people to look at. Here's another example of that. Using just different tones of greens and yellows makes it much more pleasant than just different kinds of colors in an area. And actually, these three maps are different, and they're trying to tell you all the differences, but because the colors are so confusing, it actually is harder to tell the difference here because you don't have consistent color, where you could just change the tone, like ramp that blue and from blue to red. If you just ramp that from the 5% to the 75% was just a different green, like on the left, it'd be much easier to see and understand, and you'd also be able to tell the changes. This is a project that I worked on. Warushka worked on this some too. Working on an island, and I want you, and this is actually, this was done for Deme and the Weather Makers, and we did this all in Illustrator. And look at this island here. I think the only pure black we have is the prevailing wind in the top right. Reverse type does not work very well unless it's just one line easily read. And you can see, but if it was black, it would actually be harder to read. You don't do reverse text or white text in paragraphs. You use it for labels. That's about the only time we use it. And sometimes, like in the lower left there, beach habitat, when it goes into the yellow, that got a little bit harder to read, but we can adjust those too. But what's nice about this, the trees, the soil, all of this was done in Illustrator, is a really good sense of what they're going to get when they build this island, the idea. This is a concept that we did for them. And then on the lower right, you can kind of see the elevation for that. The same thing is very simple. Little bit of gradient in the sand, very simple trees and shrubs, keeping it to an absolute minimum because we know there's going to be changes. And just doing what graphics we need to do in order to get it across. So the least amount of effort on our part for the most amount of effect, and then we take it to the next level where we feel it needs a little bit of help. This is that same graphic. Again, this actually came from the information that they sent us. I don't even remember what those calculations are, but they sent us all this stuff in a PDF. We open that PDF in Illustrator, and now we can create our own artwork from what they're sending us. And again, we're just using the same information that we used before. We're using the same colors. So we're trying to be very consistent with that. And of course, in this case, the text is black because it's more of an engineering drawing. And what you're seeing on the left there, that's actually tides and wave action that's hitting that island. So we're bringing in our ecological design on this, our ecological communication, but many times we have to incorporate other people's graphics. Even if we don't understand what it means totally, they do. So then we still have an opportunity to lay the graphics out, and we changed it so that it was easier to read, and then they just look good, that people can tell what's going on. So this was basically defining what the shoreline, the two different shorelines of this island would look like. Scales, slopes, all those kinds of things, doing that correct. And then you see our little trees at the top. Even on this case, my little salt spray arrow was part of what a windbreak does with the wind and the salt spray, that actually would help collect the salt before it goes inland. So things like that we can add, and it helps for them. So lastly, I'll say on this is keys to the easy read. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make maps of muted colors and tones, variable transparency so that we can layer information, screened back details so that if you need to see it, you can go look for it. Otherwise, they're in the background. We always want to show the topography, soil, and other data. And what we're doing is building a graphic standard. Common color palette, and saves spaces in our reports for other information. So a common color palette is really what I'm going for in our design work, so that when people see United Designers work, or they see my work or your work, they know that, okay, that's the language. And we're actually setting a whole standard for people. As more of us work this way, we are setting the standard of expectation for the rest of permaculture. All right.